You're listening to the Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips, where we present audiobook quality readings of the classics for your enjoyment. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, just because you're a bumpkin doesn't mean you can't be cultured. Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. I'm Jake Phillips. So if this is your first time here, or maybe you've just started listening and don't know anything about me, I'm a voice actor. It's what I do for a living. And I love classic literature, which you probably guessed. I just like to present, audiobook style readings of the classics so that you can, whatever level you're at, whether you're a MFA professor at the university level or you haven't read, the only English literature, let's say, that you've heard was some sort of panicked teenager in front of a class. And so that is your experience with literature, and now you want to hear it in another setting. Whichever, if you're either of those or anywhere in between, hopefully by putting sort of a audiobook style thing in front of you, you can enjoy it. We can all sort of connect through the great writers of the past. So this is Mark Twain. And obviously Mark Twain was a great writer, especially in the latter half of the 19th century. He really was a world-famous guy. He did speaking tours. He was funny. And when you read his writing, some people, they'll write, and you have to be told this guy was really funny, and you read it and you're like, okay, I'm trusting you. I trust you that he was funny, but I don't really see anything funny. Mark Twain was, even by today's standards, hilarious. You can read his stuff and be like, man, this guy, he's got a really funny sense of humor that I get even, 150 years later, 120 years later, depending on, whenever it was. And so, anyway, I really like Mark Twain for that. And this was sort of the story that really kicked off his published writing career. And so, it's ridiculous and hilarious. And I hope that this makes you want to go and maybe read it, like read the words yourself, or even look up somewhere like, let's say, AmericanLiterature.com and see what other short essays he has. Everybody knows about Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. He's got a ton of short essays and short stories that are very entertaining that you would probably love. But anyway, I digress. Let's jump right in. The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend Leonidas W. Smiley as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me a good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with a chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm,
But all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. H.M., Reverend Lewell. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49, or maybe it was the spring of 50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one of the others, I remember the big flume weren't varnished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller's offered a bet on it, and take any side you please, as I was telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. If there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. If there was a camp meeting, he would be the regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here, and he was, too, and a good man. If he ever see a straddlebug start to go anywhere, he'd bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of boys here has seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The dangdest fella. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once, for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning, he come in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't anyway." This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of the kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to one side among the fences, and kicking up the mower dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing, blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead and near as you could cipher it down. And he had this little small bull pup that when you look at him, you'd think he weren't worth a cent, but set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up, he was a different dog. His underjaw would begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamship, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And the dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on, but he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. And then, all of a sudden, he would grab that other dog just by the giant of his hind leg and freeze to it, not chaw, you understand. He would just grip it and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out a winner on that pup, till he was harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt, he seen a minute how he'd been imposed on and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. He appeared surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as such to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting a dog in there that had no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd have lived, for the stuff in him he had was genius. I know, because he had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home, and he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn to jump too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. Seen him turn a somersault, maybe a couple, if he had a good start, and then come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in a matter of catching flies and kept him in the practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I'd seen him set Daniel Webster down there on this floor, Daniel Webster was the name of the dog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud and start scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't any idea he was doing any more than a frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well might he be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywhere all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might that be you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it around this way and that and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He'ng out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and gave it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about the frog that's any better than other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a moment, and then he says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him up full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and gave him to this feller and says, "Now if you're ready, set him alongside of Dan'l with his 4 paws just even with Dan'l's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the other fella touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively. But Dan'l give a heave and hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman, but weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the doctor, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder so at Dan'l and says, again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan'l a long time, and at last says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Dan'l up by the nape of the neck and hefted him and said, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. And he turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And when he see how it was, he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and he got up to see what was wanted. And turning to see me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't gonna be gone a second." By your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this here Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave."
Wasn't that great? I love that story. That's so good. And I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, I sure hope you'll subscribe. I'd love it if you would leave a review if you could. Maybe tell a friend about this podcast. And thank you very much for listening.
You've been listening to The Cultured Bumpkin, a literature podcast with Jake Phillips. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, would you mind going and subscribing and leaving a nice review on whatever podcast platform you heard this on? I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.